once I left, I was finally able to find friends I could be authentic with for the
Mm,
first time, and it was like such a big switch. And being able to find purpose outside of the cult was really a big deal for me too. And like being okay with not being certain, being
mm,
okay with not having to like find new answers for those same questions, of being okay with spiritual exploration and not pressuring myself to like live this impossible standard of life.
mm. Okay.
Okay, 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today.
Most definitely. And so, throughout my teen years and even in college, I struggled with major depression. Like I've had 4 major depressive episodes, throughout my
Understandable.
life.
Like,
Yeah, really
good
terrible.
gravy. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there was so much shame around it growing up, and there was a lot of blame and from my parents, and they didn't know how to handle it. And my dad was really terrible too at handling it, because there was one really terrible episode of my teen years where I just stopped eating. I couldn't eat
Mm,
anymore, and it was just dealing with religious, I mean, not knowing this then, but looking back, it was like religious trauma, internalized homophobia,
mhm.
just dealing with the toxic environment I grew up in too, because it wasn't, I grew up in a codependent family, very toxic family dynamic, not being able to have needs or express them or express emotions or express opinions. It was like walking on eggshells at
Mm,
home. And so I was always in like high alert or hypervigilance, which is constantly like aware of my environment and being careful. So,
and how
um,
tiring, like how exhausting to
mm,
constantly be
oh,
on the lookout. Yeah.
yeah, most definitely. And, when I had a terrible depressive episode and like I couldn't eat anymore, like my appetite was just gone, which that, people have different symptoms in response. Some people eat a lot when they're depressed. It's
Hmm.
different how people react. So for me, it was not eating. And so like I remember losing 20 pounds in 2 weeks. Like it was
Two
that bad.
weeks. Oh my
Yes.
goodness.
Like
Mm,
when you don't eat, yeah, like, and my parents were noticing how much weight I was losing and how sick I was
mm-hmm.
beginning to look, and they just didn't handle it well. There were a lot of things, I wasn't educated in psychology or mental health. I was
Mm-hmm.
told mental health is my fault and that I need to pray and read the Bible more and that demons are attacking me. So there was no, like, I wasn't given mental health care or even taken to a doctor. Like, my dad just yelled at me at the dinner table to eat and just got really angry and verbally abusive. And me, that's not helping. You're not supposed to yell at
Right.
anyone who has mental health or is struggling through that.
No.
So, like, I remember, like, running to the bathroom and just crying and not knowing what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, if I could eat, I would throw it up. I would just, not purposely, like, I wasn't purging.
Right.
Like, it was just my body holding in all that trauma
Mm.
was trying to find a way to get it out.
Your
And
body was telling you
ooh,
something's wrong.
something's
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
And the trauma was trying to just get out all those
Mm.
years of it, I think. And so for me, how my body responded to that trauma was, this is crazy when I say it to a lot of people, but because I grew up in this extreme environment, my mind's way of dealing with that trauma was forming a different identity, really. Like, I began to think I was someone else because I couldn't stand the thought of me. So my mind's way of
Mm.
coping was forming a different identity. And so that's how I got out of that. And it was
Mm.
something that took me a while to get out of, because I remember I would go about my day thinking I was someone else, and then I would come home or look in the mirror and be surprised
Mm.
at who I was. And I talked to my therapist about this, and he's like, yeah, it's like your mind was trying to find a way to cope and get past or
Yeah.
cope with that trauma and those
To make your
issues.
reality bearable.
Bearable,
Like,
yes.
yeah. Yeah.
And so, that's an example of like how my parents did not deal with mental health at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't trust them. They lost their trust from a very early age from me. So I really suffered in silence through a lot of things because the shame that was around it. And so in college, here I am dealing with depression, having 2 depressive episodes while at Bob Jones, dealing with all this shit. And it wasn't until I think I was 20 that I discovered the term religious trauma, and that really freaked me out because I'm like, my entire life has been in this religious system, and like I didn't want to deal, or like I wasn't ready to grieve all the harm or ready to deal with that anger or that betrayal and those hard emotions. So for me, I just like, I'm not going to deal with that. And like, I really underestimated.
You're like, I'm going to save that for the future.
Yeah.
I'm not going to, like,
we're not going to deal with that. Not today.
Or like, when there's like that TikTok that you like open the door and they're like, is there another door? Like, you know what I'm talking?
Yes, most definitely. Yeah. And so for me though, as I struggle with my mental health symptoms, I was like, I'm like, everything they're telling me to do is not working. And at that time, I had been meeting with the biblical counselor at Bob Jones, because there were no mental health people there or anyone qualified. So there were no choices for me, since I wasn't happy about going to a biblical counselor, but I'm like, I just need to talk to someone because that can help. But this person, obviously, they weren't trauma informed. They weren't trained in mental health, so they didn't handle it well. Like, I remember one day I had...
Those dang religious counselors that aren't... anyways.
Yeah, and so after I didn't tell him all of my story, but a lot of different things I experienced, and, he blamed me. He said, oh, you're paying for your sin. Like, so at that moment, going into his office already suicidal, hearing him just blame me for all these terrible experiences, I was like, I think that was like the last straw for me, where I was like, I'm getting the fuck out of this environment. Yes. I'm not sure how, but I'm not doing this. Out. And so thankfully, like I connected with people in the Greenville community, and so that's going to help connect when I tell the rest of the story at Bob Jones. But I connected with people in Bob Jones, while I was at Bob Jones on the outside in Greenville, that weren't in the group or in that religion, that I had made friends with, because I went to churches that were on the blacklist that I was not allowed to go to find.
The banned churches, yes.
Yeah. And like, I remember going to a progressive Christian church, and it was like the first time I felt like safe in a church, when I didn't feel shame, and I actually felt like refreshed leaving the building. I was like, what is this? This is weird. Like, I don't...
What is this healthy religion? Like,
what is this?
I didn't know it existed. Oh my gosh.
And so that's where
little heart.
Yeah, that's where I met a family that was like, felt bad for my situation. I got to know them, and they let me like really come to their house to get away from Bob Jones. And, as the years went on, and I know, for me, I kept telling myself I'm leaving like after the graduation, but I still made excuses to stay in that environment. I kept I'm like, oh, well, I can work for like BGU Press, their school curriculum, as like a designer, and for a little bit, and save and then get out. But I noticed that I kept making excuses to stay, and I'm like, but I don't really want to do this. I'm like, how am I going to get out of this? I don't know how. And so, flash forward, basically, that was my senior year. That first semester, which is the fall of 2021, so yeah, a year ago, I was working on a religious trauma photo series to really start digging through my religious trauma, because I became so serious about digging into that, because it was, I think the spring of 2021 was when I was done with that biblical counselor, and I decided to just leave Christianity, because I'm like, this is the best this is what I need for mental health, because learning about what that biblical counselor didn't understand, it didn't matter how many pretty Bible verses he could say to me. Because of all the trauma, and in psychology, it's called classical conditioning, is when we associate an experience with a stimulus. So for me, I associated automatically a lot of traumatic things with Christianity, the Bible, and Jesus. So that was triggering to me, because my brain and my unconsciousness was associated that. So it didn't matter how many wonderful, pretty things he could take out of the Bible about how living Jesus was. It didn't matter, because it was triggering. I need to work through that trauma with a therapist.
Your brain filed it as unsafe.
Yes,
even
my
if
brain.
In the moment you were technically safe.
Yes. So it's
Yeah.
triggering. So even though then I didn't have that psychological language, I'm like this dude, like you don't know
It's
what you're
not
doing.
helping.
This is not. You don't understand. Like they think you can like prescribe a Bible verse like a pill, and it will like be okay. And it's like it's not that simple.
No.
And it's just the way they approach it is like not trauma informed at all. And and like I've heard some people be in biblical counseling. They're like, oh, like why haven't you gotten over that? Let it go. And it's like, if you're not trauma
Oh,
informed,
I'm saved now. I'm fixed. Thank you. I just let it go, and it's all better.
and it's like people don't understand how trauma lives in your body and mind, and it takes time to work through that.
Oh,
But
yeah.
that religious
You're
trauma,
like, I have had X number of years being
yes,
in this. Do you think I can just like slough it off and let it go and like wake up and it's all better? Like,
yeah, like it was just frustrating. And so, for me, as I really like took the time and effort to dig into, especially that summer, dig some more into psychology. And at that point, I had been on antidepressants a year, which I had finally found my way to get on antidepressants just to help me cope. I knew it wasn't the
oh
answer.
yeah,
It wasn't the answer for me, and it wasn't going to heal trauma, but it helped me cope with life.
give you a
while
boost,
yeah,
so you
boost.
can just get your head above water. So you can, yeah.
Yes. And so, I was on antidepressants for 2 years. Thankfully, a month ago, I got off of them because I decided that because I've been in therapy almost a year, and like it has been wonderful. Oh my gosh, and
Good.
we'll get into that a little bit more. But
Yeah.
while I was working through that photo series of religious trauma, I spent 60 plus hours working on it.
Oh
Like
wow.
it was like really important to me, and it was really hard. It was really hard to make, and there were days I was just like in a fetal position in bed, like trying to like take a break because I'm like, this is really hard to
Right, because you're
process.
doing like a lot of inner work, and it's also fresh. You're
It is
still like
fresh.
in it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so just doing that was so helpful. But I was like, I want to share this with the world. I want to share this series that I made and my story. And so I decided, I'm like, who am I going to promote this to? What audience will take this in? And I noticed that Josh Harris, he had an IGTV live show or on Instagram that he let people tell their stories and he interviewed them. And so I reached out to him and I was like, hey, like, I would love to share my story and talk about religious trauma and the photo series I created. I would love to talk about it and share it because this is like really important to me. And so he got back to me. He's like, I'll let you on the show. And like, part of me is like, oh, he'll never see this. He'll never respond to me. But he did. And like, when that happened, there were different, like, I guess I would say things going on in my mind. Like, oh, like this is great. Or, oh, you shouldn't do this. This is risky. Like you're going to get kicked out. But there was this intuitive feeling inside of me that was like, do it. You have to do this. Like it was really me like prioritizing my mental health, I guess, for the first time of like I need to be seen, heard, and understood because I never publicly like or even privately with people tell my story because there was no one safe. I felt like to do that would listen and truly care at all. And so, I decided I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna go on this show. I'm gonna be honest, authentic, and I'm gonna approach it in an open-minded and loving way, just telling my story. And, if I get kicked out for telling my story and being honest, then, that says more about Bob Jones and not me.
That's amazing that you could do that though. Like how incredible and brave that you're like, this is me and I'm gonna do it, even though you have all of those years of fear-based
Yeah.
junk. Like, that's incredible.
Yeah, thank you. And so, I think what really helped me get to that point was that, so I did this right before I turned 22. I've been writing a book since I was 19 years old. So for the context of that, that has helped me process a lot of things. And like right now, the book is at like 57,000 words.
Wow.
So it was
I don't know
me.
how much. I don't know. I have no concept of like how long that or how many pages that would be.
Oof, I'm not sure either because like I have double spaced my
Okay.
manuscript to help me
But
type
long,
and read. It's
basically.
long.
Yeah.
It's long. It's definitely
Yeah.
over like 100 and something pages now, or almost
Okay,
200
yeah.
maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that really helped me process that to get that point.
Yeah.
It's because I had spent a couple of years writing down my life experiences and
Mm-hmm.
editing it, and it's something I will eventually publish. I'm still working.
Cool.
I'm working on the second draft now, and to me, I'm combining memoir and psychology to help people in similar situations, help them process and work through their own experiences, also through like being validated and relating, but also knowing the terms and what's really going on internally and psychologically, to help them deal with that. So, like, it's me basically recording my healing journey through religious trauma
Yeah.
and through my story. But once I shared this story with Joshua Harris, it was like this negative energy had been stuck in me for so long, or this like holding back, this masking. It was like not being able to be authentic in any environment, and being able to be authentic was releasing. Now, obviously, there was still so much trauma still in me, but there was a part of me that just, it just felt, I felt a weight lifted once I did that. And to me, that was worth it, to be authentic and to take care of my mental health and to be public and share my story and inspire other people. But, 10 days later, I was expelled from Bob Jones. It was my last semester. And, thankfully, I was able to move in with that family I met while I was at Bob Jones that were on the outside. And they've been so incredible, as I've almost, in January, it'll be a year since that happened. But yes, when I was expelled, I was like, I can say whatever I want now
You're
without,
free.
I'm free. So like, to me, like, it was way, way out of my comfort zone to go online and to talk about my story. And like, basically I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to become a content creator that's going to focus on like telling my story. I'm going to educate people on religious trauma, on cults, mental health, and help people with religion recovery, really, and deconstruction. And to me, I had to be really careful not to take the same mindset, but to a different ideology. I had to be
Yes.
careful not to be like, this is the way you deconstruct. To me,
Right.
I have a very open mind and open approach to things. I don't think there's one path to healing or one way to heal, because I think for me, I left religion and that's what was healthy for me. But for someone else, that might not be the case. They might need that comfort in a higher power or a relationship they feel with some kind of higher power. And I respect that. And as a religion recovery coach, I adapt to the client's needs and what's healthy for them. And so for me personally, I'll just say that worked for me. I needed to cut off from that religion to heal and work through those things. And like, I still consider myself spiritual, but not religious. And like, I'm still figuring all that stuff out. So that's not something I dig into depth with, because I don't think my beliefs will ever stay the same. I think they'll always be changing and evolving. And I hope they will always be evolving, because I never want to get to the point where I think I know everything about
Right.
life and just have that same mindset. But since I've left, I've been using social media to spread awareness to these issues and help people get out of these toxic environments and understand that you can find a healthy environment outside of that toxic system. And like I said earlier, like, I work for Rachel Bernstein on the Indoctrination podcast, which has been just so great because we have very similar missions, and she's done a lot of great work in the cult recovery and as a therapist. So, and I've also, for people who want life updates, like I transferred to another college, so I'm good. I'm set to graduate in May of 2023, so
Okay.
I'm excited for that. And obviously, like, I started my own podcast too to give a voice to other survivors, because the difference that it made in my life when Joshua Harris gave me that platform to be seen, heard, and understood, that's what a lot of survivors really need. And so I wanted to have that space through my podcast, really,
To give that to others then.
to give it to others. Yeah.
Yeah. So is your family still like in the cult, I guess?
Yes, they are. And it was interesting because they left the cultist church that I grew up in actually this summer, or in the past summer, back in like June or July. But they went to another church that had the same format, same beliefs, same way. So they just cult
So they
hopped.
left one cult for another.
Yeah, they did. And so, yeah, people have asked, and that's legitimate, about like, relationship with my family. And when I was expelled from Bob Jones, I had to call my parents, which this is interesting because at Bob Jones, mostly Bob Jones calls them first, and the parent shows up unannounced to you, and you're shocked to see your parent. You don't even know that you're kicked out, but your parent knows you're kicked out. That's usually how they do it. But
Oh gosh.
it's so weird, yeah. But for my situation, they didn't do that because they watched the Joshua Harris interview. They watched it
Your
beginning to
parents
end.
did.
Oh, sorry. Bob Jones watched it.
Oh,
Bob
Okay,
Jones.
say.
And that's why they kicked me out. So like they knew my story and what my parents were like, and I think they were kind of scared of them, honestly,
Oh,
to deal with that,
interesting.
because in the interview I talked about how they didn't love Bob Jones because of it didn't have the KJV only. So I think they got a picture for how extreme they were, and they didn't want to deal with that. And so they had, which I was happy they didn't call them, because I don't think they would have handled it well anyways. So I called them and I told them, yeah, like I told my story about experiencing religious trauma and how toxic it was growing up in that environment. And the thing is that I'm like, and I sent them the link to it. I'm like, if y'all want to watch it, fine. But I'm like, y'all can't invalidate anything because you don't know anything about me. You don't know your own child. You don't know what I went through secretly. So you can't say anything. So they were really bad about gaslighting and invalidating and blaming. So I'm like, you can't. But
no more.
yeah.
No.
So they asked me, they're like, oh, are we going to still have a relationship?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay, like it's up to y'all. And so they wanted to. So it's been very surface level. I mean, after I was kicked out, we didn't talk for a while because I think they had their own processing to do with the child that they tried to indoctrinate their entire lives. Yeah, and then thought they knew, just left that system. And I think they were disappointed that I was able to thrive outside of that system, because you're always
Right.
taught.
They wanted to be the source of your thriving or your success or whatever.
Yes. And so to see me still find community, find spaces outside of that area, and find resources, I think, in that cult, a way they discourage you from leaving is saying, we have the answer. We're the only way to happiness. If you leave this environment, you're going to come crawling back to us. So you might as well just stay and avoid that pain. So kind of like the prodigal son story, using that to keep
You're like,
people
watch me
in.
prove you wrong. Like,
Yes.
Yeah.
And so for me, though, in order to do that, I had to really learn emotional intelligence and self-regulation, which has been incredible through therapy. My therapist has helped me a lot with emotional regulation and noticing my body, knowing what I need and how to meet those needs. That's been crucial. And like, for people who are in cults, they take your identity and they give you one, so that when you leave the cult, you don't have your own identity, and that's why you're really so dependent on them, and that's why it's so hard to leave. So when you leave a cult, you need to have your own identity, or some form of it at least, to be independent. And thankfully I did, and that's why it made it easier, I think, for me to leave. But it's been very surface level conversations with my parents. I did set boundaries with them last fall, right before I was kicked out. I was like, you can't send me Bible verses in the mail anymore. You can't buy me these super ultra religious conservative devotional books, because I'm just going to throw them away or give them to Goodwill. So quit. That's not me anymore. And so those boundaries were set before I got kicked out. So like they knew that they couldn't talk about those things. So thankfully they've actually kept those boundaries.
Oh, good.
Which is nice, but like it's been very surface level. There are a lot of things I can't talk about that I can't tell them I'm a religion recovery coach. They don't know I have a podcast. I don't really talk much about my work with Rachel and what we're doing in the cult recovery space. And like, I've never told my parents that they raised me in a cult, because I don't think they could ever. They would
wouldn't
not
be able to.
No, they wouldn't be able.
understand.
No.
No.
And so to me, I'm like, you know what? Live in your fantasy world all you want. And, I'm going back home for the Thanksgiving this year. So that will be interesting. And like, I've had conversations with my therapist, like still struggling with that people pleasing, but being better about it, but still struggling of like at certain times ignoring those needs, and like when to have a more of a balance. But
It's
with
very
my
easy to go home
oof.
and kind of regress and be back and be
Oh,
that person that you were before. So,
yes, it's
yeah.
definitely. And like, I also have two brothers, one younger, one older. And like the youngest one, he's an atheist. And the oldest one, he's in the IFB cult. He went to Pensacola, worked there, graduated there, worked there for a couple of years, and now he's a youth pastor and a Christian school teacher at an IFB church in West Virginia with his wife.
So he's
So
in it
he's in
still.
it still
Yeah.
and heavily indoctrinated. So like that's the family dynamic, or
Yeah.
the roles that we have or who we are
Right.
now. And so with my brother, it's something that we haven't really addressed or talked about, which I don't think we ever will, because I think he's seeing what I post online, and that's made it abundantly clear that I will
Where you're
never
both
go.
at. Yeah.
Yeah, we're both that, and that I will never I would rather die than go back into that space ever again.
Well, because that space was killing you.
Oh yes,
So
it
going back in it
was.
would mean
Yeah.
death.
Oh yeah, it was terrible. It was a terrible
Yeah.
environment, and
So,
so
oh, you can finish.
no. You go. It's all good.
Well, I was just gonna say you talked about therapy, and so I'm curious
Mm,
and the importance of like being in your body. So like,
mm,
what tools or practices have
mm.
been helpful for you,
Yeah.
and kind of reclaiming your
Mm.
identity?
Yeah, so for me, when I was kicked out of Bob Jones, I was actually like using their Wi-Fi on their campus to look up therapists because I'm like, I'm going to a therapist ASAP. So the next week, I went to a therapist, had a consultation, and we clicked. And for me, I was like, how do I find someone who can help with religious trauma? Because that's not something a lot of psychologists and therapists are really trained on yet. There needs a lot more research and awareness of religious trauma in the clinical community. But for me, I'm like, okay, I need to find a therapist who at least is aware of religious trauma and this kind of toxic religious environment. And so my first therapist, he actually went to Bob Jones University and he left because it was toxic and he was studying biblical counseling and he disagreed with their view of mental health and thought it wasn't based on science, it was based on belief and doctrine and dogma. And so they decided to leave that environment and become a therapist actually. So knowing
So you
that
have a few things in common.
yeah, so since when I found that therapist, I'm like, okay, this guy understands. And to me, what was great, because like for me, like there's so many types of therapy. I was like, I didn't know what to choose, but the type of therapy I've been in is ACT, which is acceptance commitment therapy, which I think it was really good for me because this therapeutic approach, it takes the approach that all emotional responses and all emotions are valid. They're all valid, and there's no shame around having emotions, and you work through those emotions. And to me, like that's what I needed because there was so much shame around emotions. I wasn't allowed to feel or experience or show a lot of emotions. So to be with a therapist where the therapy modality is all emotions are valid, there's no shame in them, and we can work through them and the toughness of them without shame or blame, and understand them and love them and work through them. And that's been so great for me. And so for me, I think the first three sessions was like me telling my story and like working through my past. But it was he also took a person-centered approach, which I liked. So like the client is highly in control. Like he didn't really guide unless he felt there was a need to. He let it work itself out of me naturally, however that came out, and we worked through it as those things came out. It was like every session it was him like, what do you want to work through today? What's been on your mind? And so for me, struggling with disassociation, he taught me this grounding technique to help keep me present, to stop disassociating. It's called the anchoring or the anchor. And it's basically where you get in touch with every single one of your senses individually. So like you're sitting in a room and you're like, okay, I'm going to get in, pay attention to the touch. How does the chair touch? Oh, is there a pen in front of me? How does it feel? Or seeing it, like what's the color of it? Or okay, how many colors do I see in the room? Or what do I smell? What do I taste in my mouth? Or, oh, here's a mint. Let me taste it. How does it taste?
Mm-hmm.
Just because my therapist said this to me and it blew my mind. It makes so much sense because he's like, Andrew, he's like, our mind can go in the past and the future, but our body can only be in the present. We can only be in the here and now. So if we're in touch and aware of our bodies, we are present. And he's like, that's how
Mm-hmm.
you keep from disassociating. And I was like, oh, wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you put it like that. Just lay
Mm-hmm.
it out. And I was like, so that teaching me that was really helpful because I would disassociate a lot in my life through triggers and seeing different things or things people said. And so, yeah, just doing that technique because that also prevented me a lot from connecting with people. Because if you can never be present, you cannot connect
You can't
um,
connect. Yes.
at all. So
Yes.
that prevented me, which I couldn't find any true
Mm-hmm.
connection anyways in that environment. But
Yeah.
that hurt relationships as I got out, or I
Mm-hmm.
saw at some relationships that I had. I'm like, oh, that is affecting it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I've joined a local deconstruction community or a group in Greenville, which is great. A lot of ex Bob Jones people are in it, which makes sense. But it's been great to connect to people in person and have that community and learning. You know, now I feel like once I left, I didn't want to go absolute crazy because I know a lot of people they don't know how to function outside of that and they'll go to like substances to deal with that pain. And for
Mm-hmm.
me, I was like, you know, let's go to therapy, let's journal, let's do
Mm-hmm.
meditation, let's work through this and not avoid it any longer. And so yeah, for me it's like making choices based on what is the healthiest for me. Not
Yeah.
what's the happiest, but what's the healthiest.
Hmm.
Healing is not fun. It doesn't always feel good. It can be really shitty at times.
Yeah.
And
And that's
so,
because it would have been totally understandable if you would have
mm,
left all of that and
yeah,
just not had the capacity to face it head
mm,
on and to move
yeah,
towards more
mm,
maybe potentially destructive coping mechanisms. But
mm,
the fact that you were
yeah,
like, no, I want to heal this. I want to
mm,
face it. Like that's
yeah,
huge. That's huge.
mm, yes. And like just seeing the family dynamics and understanding the intergenerational trauma and being like,
Mm,
I'm not gonna wait till my 30s or 40s to like deal with this and have this packed down inside and suffering because I've seen effects of some of my own
mm,
cousins of them not dealing with their own traumas and they make terrible decisions and do terrible things because they haven't dealt with it and they
mm.
do unhealthy coping mechanisms because they don't know. So for me, I'm like, I'm gonna be the one to break this cycle of trauma and like
Wow.
I'm like I'm not going to feel ashamed for going to therapy because there's no shame in it at all
Oh no.
and it's a wonderful wonderful thing and I highly recommend therapy for like everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Plug for therapy. Seriously.
Yes.
I've been in therapy for I think we realized like 7 years now, and it's
Wow.
been amazing.
Mm.
Um, so I could picture like some of our listeners,
Mm.
hearing your story
Yeah.
and being like, okay, well, I think a lot of responses to when people hear kind of negative or bad or harmful
Yeah.
or
Uh-huh.
traumatic
Yeah.
stories about Christianity, they
Yeah.
say, oh, well, that's that brand of
Mm.
Christianity.
Yeah.
I'm not that kind of Christian. And,
Yeah.
and maybe that's true,
Uh-huh.
but how would you respond to folks who say, like, oh, okay, of course he left religion because that was so terrible, but that's not,
Mm.
me.
Yeah. And like I've even gotten responses and comments and DMs are very similar to this of things people say things like, "Oh, well that's not real Christianity. That's not true
Yeah,
Christianity."
that's not true. That's not Jesus, or
Yes.
whatever. Yeah.
And so people will say, "Oh, like I'm sorry you experienced this, but I had a great experience."
Right.
And blah blah blah. And what I say to people who center themselves in the conversations really around someone else's trauma, they center themselves.
Mm,
Survivors need to be seen, heard, and understood. Um, I think it's really, I understand why people do it because I was indoctrinated for so long, I grew up in it, but people feel the need to protect their religion first instead of seeing the human being. And This is another example of putting the dogma over the person. Their religion matters more than that person's experiences. It matters more than giving them emotional validation or compassion or understanding. They have to defend their religion or their reputation. It's more important. And so when people do that, or people, will say like, or think I'm a bad person for leaving religion, or judge me, I'm like, what does that say about you? What does that say about you? And to me, like, bring it back to the religion. Like, look at the mote in your own eye. Bring it back.
Yes.
And
So when they say like hashtag not all Christians, they are protecting their own religious system, their own selves,
yeah,
at the expense of connecting with you and
yes,
seeing themselves in your story, or seeing their own religion in your story.
yes, most definitely.
Okay.
And I think the conversation, and I think that people assume that when we come out with our stories, they assume that we're talking about all religion. I experienced a healthy church. That's how I met people. I know there are healthy churches and healthy systems, but if there is something going wrong in a system, it needs to be changed systemically. And there are people who think they're in a healthy religion, but they might not be. They don't want to admit that they're in an unhealthy religion. Maybe there's some unhealthy elements. And what I guess I would say to people is, quit making it about you. um, we, us survivors, when we're speaking up, we're trying to help people see the signs so they can prevent themselves from getting in these environments. If you found a healthy religious environment and that worked for you, that's great. And I've had people tell me, and obviously they're not trauma informed, they're like, oh, you should go to a different church that's healthier. And I'm telling you, I'm like, you don't understand. I'm like, it could be a healthy environment, but they could use similar language that can actually trigger my complex PTSD and send me into a panic attack because of the classical conditioning. So this is why learning mental health and learning about trauma is so important, because yes, someone might be able to go to a healthy environment that seems healthy, but there are words and language or behaviors that are triggering because they've experienced that trauma. So it's like understanding that too, and being like, and respecting people's healing journeys, and being like, what, okay, so let's say me leaving religion. There are some people who think that's not healthy at all. But for me, that's what worked for me. And like, that might not work for everyone. I'm like, if you want to stay in religion and that's going to help you and find a healthier environment, do it. I don't think there's one way to heal, to me. And that's why I talk about autonomy, which is so demonized in these environments. Is like, this is, a bad, having autonomy is a bad thing, or it's called rebellion, really. In some
because
environments,
conformity is praised above all else.
yes.
Okay. Yeah.
And so for people, only you know what is healthiest and best for you. And you have to learn to, form your own identity, get in touch with your body, your mind, your emotions, and be like, and for me, I had to get in touch with myself and be like, I had to leave this environment because it's killing me, it's unhealthy, and I need to find healing through other things.
Yeah. Well, anything else that you want to share before we wrap? Did we hit everything that we want to?
Yeah,
I mean, we could talk all day, I'm sure.
got you. I'm sure we could. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I guess, I would say, I guess, I usually talk a lot to like people who are stuck in toxic religious environments. And I guess I would say, it is okay to question, and it's really hard to. And I would say to those people, even though you're stuck in it, learn to get in touch with your mind and your body, which is easier said than done. It is. It takes time, small steps, and find, if you can, and in those environments, it's hard to even get access to internet, but if you can, start finding communities online and trying to meet people outside the group, and like, know that, I think this is important for you to know, that there is a healthy community outside of that toxic environment you're in, because I know how much these people try to keep you in, but there is a much better place outside, and like, I feel like my life is a testimony to that, because
Absolutely. Gosh.
once I left, I was finally able to find friends I could be authentic with for the first time, and it was like such a big switch, and being able to find purpose outside of the cult was really a big deal for me too. And like being okay with not being certain, being okay with not having to like find new answers for those same questions, and being okay with spiritual exploration and not pressuring myself to like live this impossible standard of life. And it takes time for people to get there. And so that's why I highly recommend the resources on my website. And for people, who want to, hear different aspects of my story, because I don't think, I've told my story a lot, but like I can't obviously tell it in its entirety. That's why I've been writing a book, because there are things I have to like not dig into much and as others, because it's a lot. Like,
Sure. I mean, it's your whole life.
yeah, my whole
Like,
life. So it's hard to. So for people who are curious about other interviews, that's also on my website and my media and press. If you're curious about other podcasts and things that I've been on.
yeah. I can't wait for that book to come out. I
Oh,
will
thank you.
happily get a
Oh,
copy.
I have a quick announcement. I'm getting
Yeah.
the Naked Pastor to illustrate my book.
Yes,
So
that's
I'm
awesome.
super excited about that.
Yeah. Cool. We probably at this point people will have seen him on the podcast while they're listening. He's
got
been on
you.
Called to Be Bad too, so that
Oh,
they'll
nice.
know who you're talking about, which is
Oh,
awesome.
yeah, he's so
That's
great.
so exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you, Andrew, so much for being on and for sharing your story. And I'm gonna let your last words be our blessing for the day, because because I think that's so beautiful. And can you repeat again what you were saying about how people need to be heard? What was it? Heard, seen, understood.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it is so important. Like, I think for people to understand, you have emotional and psychological needs, and if they're not met, it will show up in your mental health. But in environments, in any community, we need to be able to be authentic and be ourselves, and we need to be seen, heard, and understood.
Yes, seen, heard, and understood.
Yes, so much. And
Thank you so much.
Brene Brown talks a lot about this in her book, which I recommend Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown, because that book digs into 87 emotions and how to deal with them. And for me, book was so crucial with helping me with emotional regulation and recognizing and working through emotions. But yeah, as words to say are a blessing. I hate the word blessing, but
I know, that's why I was like, I'm gonna let you take the reins on that.
Yeah.
Not saying that you need to do the blessing, but just saying,
I got you. Yeah, I mean, for me,
it's a gift.
It's a gift.
Words are,
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So as I would say, like, I still have like time of gratitude. I think gratitude is so important, and that's like kind of have replaced prayer for me, which instead of like it has a different meaning for me now, but. I think, gratefulness for all that you have in your life. And I think, don't let toxic positivity take over. Understand there are things in your life. There are legitimate needs that you have in your life, and you can be grateful all you want. And gratefulness is great and is good, but recognize that there are needs that I need to be met, and being grateful or having toxic positivity is not going to meet those needs. It's just going to repress them. So what I would say to people, just to anyone stuck in these toxic environments or struggling with this toxic theology, know that you are worthy of love and acceptance. You are worthy of having a happy and healthy life. And I know in these environments we are put down so much and told that we don't deserve anything good. But I want to tell you that's not true. That's bullshit.
Yes,
You deserve to be in a community where you're seen, heard, and understood. You deserve to have those close relationships and live a life with purpose. You deserve to live life without fear, shame, and guilt constantly in your nervous system.
Yes. Thank you so much for that.
Of course.
You are doing life-saving work, and
thank you.
I am amazed at your resilience that you have come through all this.
Thank you so much.
So, thank you for coming on the show. I know that it will be a gift to our listeners.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for having me on.
That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.